Good afternoon, and welcome to this event to present the synthesis report on families, family policy, and the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Alberto Padova. I'm the Chief of the Social Inclusion and Participation Branch in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And I'm delighted to moderate this event to launch this very important study. The study looks at the role and contribution of families and family policies in the realization of the 2030 Agenda and specific Sustainable Development Goals. I think that there's a growing consensus about the fundamental role that families and family policies have in the realization of the agenda. But at the same time, I think that sometimes this important contribution is overlooked. And so, good afternoon, and welcome to this event to present the synthesis report on families, family policy, and the Sustainable Development Goals.
Not as important to have
My name is Alberto Padova. I'm the Chief of the Social Inclusion.
So that was our technology at its best. Yes, I see. So as I was saying, it's especially important because sometimes this role, it's overlooked. And so the report is actually bringing together evidence from all regions of the world about why this role is so important. And as you know, evidence-based policies are the most effective ways to ensure that they have an impact in the life of citizens. So we are fortunate to have with us not only the project coordinator, who will give opening remarks, but also the main author of the report and other contributors to the study. So let me just introduce, for those very few who don't know him yet, Ignacio Socias is the Director of International Relations at the International Federation for Family Development, which is an umbrella organization which operates in 68 countries in the world with some 8,000 volunteers in the area of families. He's also the director of the Family Watch, a think tank with research on family issues. Ignacio, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for your kind presentation and the acceptance of our offer to moderate this panel. We feel really honored to have you here today. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I feel I will have to thank many people today because we're finishing something, and something that has been the work of a real global team of experts and collaborators. But let me start by thanking the distinguished delegates from member states, as Hungary, Ecuador, Samoa, Germany we have here today. Our colleagues, representatives of NGOs, especially SOS Children's Villages, for co-sponsoring this event. And also each one of the experts attending the expert group meeting we are having during these 2 days here at the UN headquarters on family policies for inclusive societies. When the journey to define the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda began in 2012, what was then called Post-2015 Development Agenda, I had the chance to discuss with different members of the high-level panel of advisors appointed by the UN Secretary General, especially Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, today Deputy Secretary General, and they all agreed that much more than devoting one of the goals to the family, the reality was, as Alberto was highlighting now, that development is very much linked to the way families fulfill their social role, especially regarding poverty, health, education, equality, and peace. The Secretary General himself stated in one of his reports how the empowerment of families is a necessary requirement for the development goals to be achieved. This was then the real origin and the spirit of this project from the very beginning. We have been working on it for the past 3 years with the aim to show how family policies can contribute to the achievement of the SDGs. And we have tried to reflect very pragmatic processes and procedures to assess how family policies work, how the actions of non-governmental actors working in support of families can contribute, and how family attributes at household or national level impact on the effectiveness of the previously identified family interventions. To say it with the words of the General Assembly in one of its recent resolutions, it is necessary to create a conducive environment to strengthen and support all families, recognizing that equality between women and men and respect for all the human rights and fundamental freedom of all family members are essential to family well-being and to society at large. Today, we are glad to present the result of all this work. The synthesis report summarizes evidence across the 6 SDGs that cover poverty, health, education, gender equality, youth unemployment, and ending violence, highlighting important issues that policymakers may wish to consider when making future policies work for families and family policies work for the future. But the most enriching part of this project has been the contribution of such renowned and dedicated professionals who have collaborated to develop this work. Let me mention in the first place Dominic Richardson from UNICEF Office of Research, academic coordinator of the project, and the rest of the authors. Some of them are present here today. Suna Dugarova, policy specialist at the United Nations Development Programme, Mihaela Rovila, professor of Human Development and Family Studies at Queen's College of the City University of New York. Some others will be joining from the distance: Darrell Higgins, director of the Institute on Child Protection Studies at the Australian Catholic University, Keiko Hirao, professor on family and social sustainability at the Sophia University Graduate School in Tokyo, and also Sita Mokomane, associate professor of the Department of Sociology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And also, let me mention those who have managed with myself the coordination of the project: Alex Vázquez, he's our permanent representative to the United Nations, and also Irma Rognoni, City Councillor of Barcelona and a strategic advisor. The list from now to those who have supported us, believe me, is really long. We have people from the UNICEF Office of Research in Florence, from the UNICEF office here in New York. Of course, I must mention Renata Kaczmarska, the UN focal point on the family, at the division, which name I can't repeat now because it's
just changed.
Evolving, yeah, exactly. But also Professor Rosario Steniu from Mexico, the municipality of San Jose in Costa Rica, the Fundación Bancaria La Caixa, who hosted some of our events, and also Fundación Bancaria La Caixa has been one of our main funders, together with Stiftung Mayenburg from Switzerland. So thank you very much to all of you. What we really hope is to bring to lawmakers, academics, the private sector and civil society representatives, with this tool and the full publication of the outcomes, some tools that will allow them to discern what really works to help families in their social role without trying to replace them, which has been a common mistake, or to leave them alone when they deserve that help. We all see today how some changes society has experimented in the last decades, the massive incorporation of women to the labor market, and more generally, the wider range of personal choices in life, and how they have brought very positive consequences like less inequality and more freedom. But at the same time, there are some side effects that families have to bear with as the greater need for care due. Some children, sick, older people, and other vulnerable groups or groups in situation of vulnerability, that is, are left behind precisely because there is freedom. And only strong families are able to cover their needs because that is precisely what having a family is about. Only strong families can make societies be really inclusive. Only strong families can make it possible to ensure that no one is left behind, which is precisely the main aim of the 2030 Agenda. That is why families deserve support for the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies. Those will empower them to be able to fulfill their social role, and the whole society will benefit from it. Let me finish by asking you to help us to disseminate the results in your own countries as a way to accomplish the call of the last General Assembly resolution on family issues, when it encourages member states to invest in family policies and programs that promote strong intergenerational interactions, such as intergenerational living arrangements and parenting education, in an effort to promote inclusive urbanization, intergenerational solidarity, and social cohesion. We hope to be able to reach as many environments as possible, so that just as the context of the development of this project has been global, lawmakers, academics, and civil society representatives will benefit globally from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for setting the stage so well, and also for mentioning those key messages from the Secretary General reports. I think next we have now some videos, some short videos from some of the authors that could not join us in person today.
My name is Darrell Higgins. I prepared a chapter on ending violence, Sustainable Development Goal 16, and how family-related policies can assist in achievement of that goal. One of the important messages from the research I undertook was, first of all, how little we know globally about the prevalence of different forms of interpersonal violence. And that's not just in developing countries. In the West, we have very poor data on interpersonal forms of violence that relate to maltreatment of children. In terms of effectiveness of different family-related strategies, we have probably some of the better data in relation to prevention strategies relating to domestic and family violence, but at the population level, we have poor data on what actually works to prevent violence against children, including the effectiveness of some of the strategies that the literature says might be effective. We need to take these things to scale, and we need to measure and evaluate them to see whether they work when implemented at a whole of population level. Things like parenting strategies, things like respectful relationship education, and prevention strategies directed at children who are at risk of child abuse and neglect. I commend the paper to you.
Great. Next and last video is from Professor Keiko Hirao, who's Professor on Family and Social Sustainability at Sophia University in Japan.
Hello, I'm Keiko Hirao from Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. I would like to talk about our findings on how family policy can contribute to the gender equality. We paid special attention to the family leave policies and asked two questions.
First,
What is the impact of parental leave on women's labor force behavior and their income? Second, what encourages men to take parental leave? Parental leave policies are almost universal today, and the recent trend is toward longer and more generous coverages. However, we found that longer and more generous leave policies do not necessarily promote gender equality in the labor market. On the other hand, we found that daddy quota, or the leave reserved for fathers, is a promising scheme to encourage fathers to take leave from work. Gender equality in the public sphere can never be achieved unless unpaid domestic work and care work is shared more equally in the private sphere. Future family policies should give more attention to the contradicting demand that they are trying to fill. They must ensure the well-being of children while making sure that equality between gender is promoted. Thank you.
Great, and now we move back to our live presentations, and the first presenter is Mrs. Suna Dugarova, who, as you heard, is a policy specialist at UNDP, and who will present her chapter on family, youth employment, and the 2030 agenda. Suna, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for this introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here. So, as Alberto mentioned, the focus of my presentation today is the interlinkage between families, youth employment, and 2030 agenda. And specifically, yes, I will send. So specifically, I look at SDG 8, which aims to promote decent work for everybody, including young people. And I look at targets and indicators related to unemployment rate and youth not in employment, training, education. Next one, please. So I think we all know that 2030 Agenda has recognized young people as critical agents of change, and the global community has agreed that youth unemployment is a major challenge to the families, to communities, to society and economy. And in my study, I specifically raised two key questions that fall within the framework of the current report. First is what is the role of the family in promoting youth employment, and second, how can family policies or family-related interventions improve youth performance and outcomes in the labor market, and how all this can contribute to achieving the 2030 agenda. And I think the rationale behind this is, I think we all agree that home environment and how we are raised, how we're brought up, the family support we have, the quality of interaction of our parents, and affectionate environment that we have is critical to how youth develop and how they perform in the labor market. So I will go very briefly, next slide please, for the data. We don't have much time, so I will have to be very limited, but just to bring your attention to the slide, it shows the challenge of youth unemployment, which currently stands at 30% globally, and in fact it's almost 3 times higher than unemployment rate among older people, among adults. And we also have a gender dimension, and it's not a surprise that young women facing high unemployment rate when young men. The next slide shows the rate of young people not in employment, education and training. And here we also have quite staggering data, and around 22% of young people are in this situation. So on the next slide, please. So I have a conceptual framework that you can familiarize yourselves closer in the paper, but I would skip for the sake of time and leaving more space for the discussion afterwards. The next slide, please. Now I will turn more into the findings of the literature review that I have done. And basically, based on this careful review of experimental literature on family policies and policy interventions that specifically link family and youth employment, I have made 2 main observations. First, in fact, quite surprising and shocking is that there is little linkage between family policies and youth employment. And in fact, most interventions are actually focused on youth, on labor market and youth policies. But there is not so much focus within family policies on youth employment. And this is despite evidence, research evidence showing how important it is, how family interaction is important for youth performance in the labor market. And second observation is that in the situations where countries do carry out policies and programs that link family and youth employment, there is in fact lack of rigorous and systematic evaluations of these interventions. So as a matter of fact, there are quite a few programs, family programs, including child benefits, that help young people with income support and transition from youth to work, but there are a few studies that have actually evaluated those interventions, and our report very much focused on evaluated evidence. So, and next slide, please. So here's a summary that you can also find in the synthesis report that Dominic has written. And basically, at this evaluated family policy interventions that aim at improving youth employment, there are two key areas that I have found. One is related to foster care programs, and that mainly are found in developed countries and USA specifically, and conditional cash transfer programs. And in this table, I would like to draw your attention to two key findings. First is the interlinkage between different SDGs that actually Dominic has excellently put them together, and also the spillover effects that you have between different SDGs. But I also want to draw your attention that actually goes beyond those SDGs. But again, this is the focus of evaluated evidence that I was able to find. And the second finding from this table is that while family interventions are found to have positive impacts on young people's performance in the labor market, unfortunately, those positive effects are limited and don't necessarily have long-lasting impacts. So, and now I'll turn to my last slide, is on key messages that have been drawn based on the study I conducted. So first, I think that it's critical for policymakers to consider and take seriously the role of the family and family policies in shaping youth employment prospects and outcomes. As I think many other scholars would emphasize, and something that is really important, is there's more evaluation evidence is needed to examine the role of family and family policies in this area. We also, the research that has been done calls for specific policy intervention that strengthen families and address both youth and parental unemployment, because there is an intergenerational link, there is legacy issues and inheritance that we know that if parents are in better work, they have more resources to share with young people, and also has a better role model as well for their performance in the labor market. So, and finally, youth should be incorporated in family policies as part of comprehensive development strategies. And that will provide young people and families with more resources, better social security and economic security, social protection, and more sustainable outcomes. And my final slide is, I'd like to say thank you to everybody who has been involved in this exciting project, to our supporters, to organizers, to our partners, and all the colleagues who have really, over these 2 years, have become a big global family. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Esuna, for putting the finger on a very important and challenging topic like youth employment. And I think one of the points that I take away from your presentation is the gap between the strong interlinkages between the various goals and the limited integration among policies, particularly at the country level. And you mentioned, of course, employment policy and family policies.
The other point that I thought was very useful was the set of concrete recommendations that you made, and one that I stuck to my mind is the importance of family policy interventions that help prevent the intergenerational transmission of weak labor market outcomes, so that they are not inherited from one generation to the next. Our next presentation is by Michaela Robila, and she will focus on healthy lives and well-being at all ages. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It has been a privilege to be part of this team, and thank you so much, Dominique, for coordinating the project, and Ignacio for managing it. My focus was on families and goal number 3, which is ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages, particularly target 3.4, which is by 2030 reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment, and promote mental health and well-being. So I looked at family interventions for cardiovascular disease and for diabetes as indicators of non-communicable diseases. And I also looked at family interventions for suicide as indicator for mental health. Each year, about 38 million people are dying because of the non-communicable diseases. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death. It requires about 17% of health expenditure. Diabetes affects about 9% of adults, and it requires about 12% of health expenditure, so it's quite expensive to treat it. Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death for youth between 10 and 19 years of age, so these are important issues to consider. A nice map provided by Dominique's Office of Research. The darker colors indicate higher percentages, and these are the death rates for non-communicable diseases. In terms of the methodology that we used, I looked at peer-reviewed articles published in English that reported on randomized controlled trials on family policies, on family interventions for these particular diseases. We also looked at meta-analysis and different reviews, but we focused on randomized controlled trials because of their more rigorous design. I found 8 randomized controlled trials for cardiovascular diseases. They were conducted in Canada, New Zealand, Sweden, UK, and the United States. They targeted adults, so patients who had heart failure and stroke survivors, but they also were, some of them were targeting family members of patients with cardiovascular disease. 16 RCTs were found for diabetes, and they were conducted in Chile, Ireland, Taiwan, Thailand, and UK, and the United States. They targeted adults and youth, so notice that these are also focused on youth. And then there were 13 RCTs on family interventions for suicide conducted in Australia, Netherlands, Norway, UK, and the United States, and they targeted youth only, okay, and their relationship with their parents. The results of these interventions, they indicated that family interventions provided improved patients and their families' knowledge about the illness. This is very important because it provides information about risk behaviors and risk factors. They increase commitment for healthy life changes, diet, weight management, physical exercise. Some of these life changes are also long-term, after a year or so. They are also indicating improved family relations and support, so there was increased parental involvement in management of the illness, increased support for the patient. For suicide in particular, there were family-focused interventions that increased family functioning and reduced adolescent suicidality and other psychiatric symptoms. There was, however, no direct impact on health, so no improved medication adherence, for example. Most of the progress was found at the end of the intervention and soon thereafter. So, for example, at the 3rd month follow-up, the effect was still present, but it decreases or it was eliminated at the long-term follow-up. For example, at the 12th month follow-up, the effect was not there anymore. And thus the recommendations are based on these findings. And here they are, and this is my last slide. So the recommendations and the key points are to provide interventions that are based on theories, and they are of sufficient intensity and duration, and implement them through multiple methods. Some of them are a bit too short, 3-4 sessions. I would argue that is not enough. They should be longer. Most of them are provided through face-to-face interactions, followed by phone interviews, and some of them through computer-based communications through Skype, and those are as effective as the ones that are face-to-face. So using multiple methods is quite effective. A third recommendation is to create multidisciplinary teams to develop and implement family interventions and include family scientists, family counselors, family life educators on this team. I did notice that most of the professionals who are implementing these interventions were health providers, so doctors, nurses, but there was no family counselor, family life educator, and that's interesting. When we provide family interventions, there really should be somebody who has a strong background in working with families on family dynamics. Yes, thank you. Another recommendation is to promote healthy family functioning and reduce risk behavior. Family lifestyle is very important, particularly for diabetes and cardiovascular disease, also for suicide prevention. And the last recommendation, to develop and invest in policies and programs for health promotion and effective treatments at international, national, and local levels. So thank you so much.
Many thanks, Michaela, for bringing attention to particularly non-communicable diseases and how massive the impact of NCDs is around the world, particularly in developing countries. It used to be called a rich country problem. It is now, in fact, even more widespread in developing countries. We noted some of your very concrete policy recommendations, particularly the fact of considering lengthening the duration of interventions so that they have a more longer-lasting impact, as well as an approach that includes multiple expertises in the intervention. And now I'm very pleased to give the floor to the key author of the report. Kevin, you don't need, Dominic, you don't need more introductions, but just to mention that you work at the Research Institute of Innocenti in Florence for UNICEF. You have the floor, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you everybody for joining us today. This is an important day for us. It's the culmination of almost 2 years' work, lots of it friendly, some of it less so, but here we are. And I want to say thanks to everybody that everyone has already said thanks to. But it's important to note that we feel this piece of work is an important substantive step in the move from the SDG targets, which is where we want to go, and mapping how we get there. And without the support of our funders and the support of our international organization colleagues, we wouldn't be here today. So thank you for that. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about three things. Try and keep it simple. I want to talk about why we've done this work. I want to tell you a bit about how we've done this work, and I'll finish by telling you what it told us. There's some strong messages, I think, but you'll have to keep your powder dry because they come last. So something you'll hear, and I'm sure you'll hear it for the next 12 years or so in family circles, is that across the SDGs, if you look at the goals and targets, family is only mentioned a few times. It's rarely mentioned. Family is rarely mentioned in those goals, and the reasons why this may be the case could be to do with the politicization of family, but it also could be to do with what I'm talking about when I say moving from where we want to go to how we get there. We've taken a view of the family in our report as a conduit to social change. The family is the fundamental unit of society. It's our smallest social unit. It's the foundation on which we build everything else, all of our social interaction. And in being that, it is the place where we intervene mostly when we want to intervene for children and other dependents, when we want to support labour market access, when we want to encourage health, when we want to lower violence, and so on. And so the first and main reason we're undertaking this report is because we want to move the discourse as quickly as possible from where we want to go to how we get there, because we're 3 years in. We've got 12 years left. If you build an education service, you can wait 15 years for returns on that. So we need to move quickly. The second reason that we focus on the family is because despite the discourse and the politicization of family, if you were to look at national accounts in the high-income countries, 70+ % of national investment is going onto policies which face the family. We're talking about education, health, social protection. They are the main vehicle for intervention. We don't need to argue that point, but for some reason there's a blind spot. Some reason we don't want to admit it, and we prefer to talk about other factors in social progress, even though our action should speak louder than our words. And finally, it's long been acknowledged that success in one part of social progress can spill over into another part of social progress. If you're healthy, you can learn. If you've learned, you can earn, and so on. If you've earned, you can buy a house, and so on and so on and so on. But when we look at the SDGs, we do what every index does, and we juxtapose goals as if they're independent, as if we can set off on 169 different tracks and achieve those goals, and we can't. We have 12 years. An average ministry, for those of you working in government, an average government is going to have maybe 10 family-facing ministries. That's a big disparity between 9 and 10 action points and 169 goals. We need to think innovatively and smartly and move quickly to multiple goals with single interventions. And that's really a key push in this work. So what did we do? How did we get there? Oh, I forgot to introduce the slide. I have one slide, but it's really the main slide. Ironically, this is on page 42 of the report. And if you know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, 42 is the number which is the answer to everything. And this is where our summary chart is. It's not the answer to everything, but it is a strong indication of what's possible when investing in one stream of family policy for returns in other family policies. And you read this as the left-hand column shows the 6 goals we've focused on. And as you work across in the row, where you have light blue, we have found significant evidence of spillovers of action in that area into those other goals. So let's look at number 1, no poverty. Our review showed interventions designed to reduce poverty in families through the family, and with the family resulted in improvements in health, education, gender equity, and employment. This slide leads me nicely into the next thing, which is how we did this. And the first thing I'd like to start with is a little bit of caution. If we had all of the evidence available to us all of the time, we wouldn't be sitting in this room. We'd go out and do the action, right? We'd know what we were doing. We'd have no worries about it. But we don't, which is why I have a job as a researcher to try and come up with some of these answers. And because the data's not all there, we can only give you an indication, a sample of what we know. And this is just a sample of what we can see, because we selected particular methods and we selected particular studies. And I'll tell you a bit about that. Where you see a white square under peace in that chart, it doesn't mean that we're saying that anti-poverty policies cannot affect peace. No, by no means. And certainly along health, it doesn't mean that health does not affect any of those other outcomes. Of course it does. But the studies we've looked at are mainly program studies and not so often systemic policy-wide studies, because they're often not evaluated, which means they weren't selected into our study. But some of these things we take for granted. You build houses, there's more houses. You pay in cash, you'll have more cash. But when you want to evaluate the positive spillovers of something which is a little less direct, that's where you'll have evaluation, and that's the type of thing we've looked at. So we've covered these 6 goals. Ignacio mentioned them earlier, and within each one we selected a couple of targets. And it took us 2 years to do the whole thing with around about 12 to 15 targets. If we'd have taken all of the targets, you would have waited till 2030, which would have been a bit too late. You can see the rationale for how we've selected them, but we've mainly chosen goals that would not create too much of a challenge in the consensus of which goals are mainly facing the family. We understand that the family is involved in meeting environment goals. We understand the family is involved in meeting inclusive society goals. We understand those things. But there is a consideration to be taken about to what extent is the family a focal intervention point in those goals. And we've made some judgments, and you can read the report and happily disagree with it. But it sets some examples. When we've reviewed each of these targets, what we've done is we've gone to the literature, we've gone to the data first of all, and looked for where these goals have been operationalized. That means where someone has measured this goal as globally as possible, and then we've assessed it for whether or not those measures are robust, whether they're valid, which means whether they're accurate, whether they're reliable, which means whether they're repeatable. And when we're happy that's the case, we report it. We've then done a literature review around policies that affect variation or how that indicator moves. And we've taken a 3-step approach. We've looked for studies that are conceptually coherent. That means, does it make social sense? When you talk about poverty, are you at least measuring the deprivation of one thing or another? And then we looked at methods to ensure that the methods chosen to answer that question were appropriate. When it's an evaluation, it should have some sort of evaluation attributional aspect. If it's to look at determinants, it should have some sort of qualitative aspect. And then we looked to see whether having the concept right and the method right, whether the author did a good job in terms of getting the numbers right. And if they did all of those 3 things, we looked at it. In the end, we got 150 studies and a bit more. And they're all in the back of the report. Cautions of this is that there's quite a high standard because we want to stand on strong evidence ground. But that means that we inadvertently collect more data from high-income countries. We inadvertently miss out some regions of the world that we don't want to miss out. But the data isn't there, so we'll come back to those in recommendations. And in some areas of the goals, our evidence is not universal. The evidence on gender equity and leave policies, for instance, is all from high-income countries. That's not to say we don't believe that gender equity is an issue elsewhere in the world. It's just this is what we've got to work with now, and we'll recommend building that base. The second thing is that all of this evidence is just an indication. The comparative work gives you a direction. If you're a policymaker, it doesn't give you a directive. It can never tell you what to do. It just gives you an idea of where you might want to go. It points you on a path, because we don't know your specific contexts. But we do know enough about various other contexts to give you an idea of what might work. So that's what we've done. So our findings. All of you will not be surprised to hear that there is no silver bullet for meeting the SDGs, and there's no obvious way, there's no one-size-fits-all way of delivering family policy. But our evidence from our work around poverty, for instance, and though we could be extending the coverage of those studies, there's good indication that whether it's conditional or unconditional, whether it goes to a grandparent or a mother or a father, cash benefits are having an effect on short-term poverty reduction. No big surprise, you give someone money, they have more money. You measure it, they have less poverty. The trick is whether they invest that wisely for sustainable change to that poverty risk. And when we look at conditional cash transfers or non-conditional cash transfers that are designed to encourage take-up of other services, we get some positive results. Where the positive spillover starts to break down is in whether those services, the second service actually achieves its goal. Whether you get the children into school is one thing. Whether they are learning once they're in school is another. And we can't stop our push for making family policies effective when the kids are in school. It needs to keep going. In terms of family services, there's access to the labour market through childcare, which we look at in education. There's spillovers into labour market and career paths. Gender equity we look at in leave. In health, we see positive effects on family engagement for behavioural change. And the same, of course, with ending violence. Family-level intervention, engagement with the family, parental programs, these almost always evaluate well. Where we have policies that mix both cash and kind, I'm talking about leave policies and CCTs. Sometimes I think there's two questions we need to think about. One is in terms of quality and one is in terms of equity. Sometimes family policies don't do their job, and sometimes they do things we don't want them to do at all. And when I mentioned the CCTs, you do get children into school, but they might not be learning, so we have to make sure that those schools are of good quality too. And there's equitable coverage, and in leave, we need to make sure that there's gender equity. Demographic trends will suggest that there'll be more single-headed households, and more of them will be headed by women, in some cases grandmothers. And policies, family policies, which are to the detriment of gender equity in the labour market, will have an inevitable effect on the long-term earning of those families, create poverty, and we're back in the same problem at the beginning. We need another family policy to fix a bad family policy. So gender equity and quality should be at the front of our minds. The broad and the final things I'll say is we have general cross-cutting findings that we want to stress. In violence and violence against children, it's deeply concerning that we don't have the data we need to understand the prevalence and severity and the variation in the types of violence experienced in the home. It's crazy. We need more data, basically, across a range of things. And we need to build evidence around that for family policy, particularly around integration of policies that meet multiple goals and implementation of how these things are done. Again, we can talk about what family policies and where we want to go, but if we don't give policymakers information on how to do it, they won't be able to do it the way we might hope that they will. Scalability and transferability needs work, and practitioners need to be brought in. We need to understand better the role of practitioners working with the family, particularly around acute needs around violence and health. And these are the things we found, and we hope that you take them to heart and take them back to where you're working and express them. So I wanted to finish with our final paragraph, which is families are the elementary social unit, and the progress of families will inevitably impact the progress of our societies. In that sense, families are the enabling factor to achieving the SDGs, a enabling factor, a very important one. And whilst governments and other actors in society are asked to meet these SDGs, the role of strong families and strong family policy cannot be left out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for this broad-ranging description of the key findings of the report. but also for pointing out some of the actions that policymakers and all the stakeholders need to take into account going back to their respective jobs in this area. 42 might not have all of the answers, but I think table on page 42 has quite a few of them, so thank you for pointing us to that. But also for being frank in terms of the fact that not all of the analysis that the group has done have come out with very clear results in terms of, you know, in many cases the limited availability of data, and so clearly there is more work ahead of us also in terms of research analysis and collection of data. That is something that we ourselves are fully aware of, especially with the very ambitious agenda that the SDGs have set for us in terms of all the targets and indicators, many of which unfortunately still don't have much data to go by. So now I'm opening the floor for comments, questions. The floor is open. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all of your presentation. It's been a pleasure to follow your work throughout this past year, and I would like to congratulate you for the research undertaken. I'm really happy that that the conversation is moving forward on family policies. As you know, at the Agenda 2030, there was a lack of consensus among member states on the way of looking on families, which hindered further progress on this issue. But there is consensus on the fact that family is a fundamental unit and an entry point for policies in societies, and the first natural setting for newborn persons. And all of us want better outcomes for family members, and Hungary is a very strong supporter of strong families and family policies. You know, good family policies are, let's say, social policies with a bonus. They provide better human rights protection for members of the family, gender equality, better outcomes in terms of health, education, and so on and so forth, what you have already mentioned. And they also have a spillover impact on the extended family. And so I believe, and I think that a lot of the other member states share my belief, that moving the conversation forward on this issue is very important. And in that respect, research such as you undertaken is key in enabling us to build on evidence that is out there. And I have seen a progress on this topic during the past year at the UN. So we now really try to speak about concrete action to be taken, and you can see them in UN documents and resolution, how they feed into the intergovernmental discussion, which is a huge asset, and Hungary is trying to be a bridge builder on these issues. So thank you again for your work, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Sofia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, congratulations to the team for the different studies and the publication as a whole. I had the privilege of observing from the side the process of it and be part of some of the conversations. And it really is a fantastic study and a brave study, because of what the representative from Hungary was saying. It's a conversation that needs to be had. So it's a fantastic first step. Each of the studies could be a whole publication in itself and much more. So I hope this is really only the beginning of bringing practical ideas and bringing the how to achieve this very complicated and colorful conversation that are the SDGs. And I think, so SOS Children's Villages works with children without parental care and at risk of losing it. So with families at risk of breaking down. So our perspective into the family is from, and is what I want to bring here today, is say the same just from the other side of the coin, is not to prove how beneficial investing in family policies can be, but how negative the consequences are if these family policies are not put in place and if families are not supported. And that is negative for the child and thus for the society as a whole. Dominique said, and others have mentioned in different ways, that the family is the main vehicle for intervention. Just to illustrate with an example, social protection reaches the child through the family. It's the parents who are going to bring the child to the hospital or to school. When the family is not there, and we work with 80,000 children living in alternative care, the child doesn't have that first structure of protection. And so it is really, we see in our program work all around the world that no matter what cultural context, no matter what political definition you want to give, if the family is not there, the child suffers and the society as a whole suffers. So, and also just one more comment on to illustrate with an example, it's very interesting about youth employment. One of the most difficult things that a young person that doesn't grow up in his or her family experiences is transitioning to adulthood. We just published a report on 12 countries about employability for young people that don't live with their families. And it's not only the performance aspect that was so well illustrated in this publication, but they even experience discrimination in finding the job on the first place, because when you go to find a job and you say, I don't live with my family, or I live in alternative care or in residential care, there is a very big stigma already into it, which shows the point that while maybe in policy is not so obvious, or now in the UN environment we struggle to talk about it already, in the daily life, it is obvious that the family is this main vehicle for intervention. So thank you very much for inviting me, and congratulations for the great report.
Thank you, and I would be grateful if participants could keep their interventions very short so that more colleagues can intervene. Donna.
Congratulations. I know this was quite a lot of work, and the results are really wonderful. You mentioned a couple of times grandparents and intergenerational solidarity, and I haven't had a chance to read the report yet, but I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit more about what you were thinking, what you were finding, and the important role we know that grandparents are playing around the world, stepping in not just to raise children, but also to provide that extra support to families. And what struck me was when Mihaela was talking about the suicide rate among adolescents in the U.S., and we know that there's a lot of attention right now on social isolation and the detrimental effects, and that in fact, while people thought it was older adults that were more socially isolated, it's really more younger people. So again, then that role that older adults can play in providing support to the family and support to the younger members of the family. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take another two comments or questions, and then we'll have a round for the panelists. Please.
First, congratulations on such wonderful work, and I think every policymakers and also family community advocates should have it. And I haven't got a chance to read it, but quickly look at your table. Really nice presentations, and so got the graphs of information. And I wonder whether China, India, all those countries are the reviewed studies have been, part of this, or, just curious. I don't mean they have to be included, but just curious, and if not, what barriers are from including them.
Thank you. One more before we go. Please.
Okay, I don't know how this works. Okay, my name is Asibi from Nigeria, and I wanted to know if your report covers anything that has to do with West Africa as as it is. And I wanted to say congratulations also on the work that has been done. And the thing is, coming from Nigeria, there's not a lot of sensitization and awareness based on even the International Families Day was something that I realized about last year. So this has been quite an experience for me. And the study of family structure is not so vast in where I'm coming from. So that is an issue. And I just want to understand if there's anything in your report that deals with West Africa. And yeah.
Thank you. Dominic, should I give the floor? Thank you.
In terms, thank you for the questions. In terms of the country coverage, we do have studies from India, and I'm sure that we reviewed studies from China as well. About 10% of our, maybe a bit more, 10% of our reviews covered existing meta-analyses, which were already covering global issues. We cover a fair number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I couldn't say exactly whether any in West Africa. What we've done is each author has been asked to set a review strategy, which was global. Everybody had to cover as many countries as possible, and then from all of those, they had to determine which studies could go into our report. So we have two lists. We have a list of studies that passed the quality assurance test, and we have a list of studies that didn't for one reason or another. It may not be because... So we could look through both and share that with you afterwards. In response to Donna and grandparents, when I was talking about grandparents, the thing I had in my mind was the child support grant in South Africa, but we might equally talk about childcare policies in Australia. I believe in Hungary at some point there was a connection to grandparents in the childcare policy, official connection. There is no reason why we shouldn't be using the family in all its forms when it comes to raising solid social units and aiming for global social progress. And grandparents obviously have an important role to play. And I think it's an underutilized concept, partially because there's so much internal displacement related to job marks and job insecurity in high-income countries and low-income countries too. My children are not close to their grandparents, I'm afraid, because I had to move for work. So there are some concerns and limitations, but this idea of intergenerational households and intergenerational communities is really compelling. And your example with suicide, and particularly of older youth who have left home and go into higher education or labour market expected to move village or town or whatever, I think this is something that is forward-thinking and should be pursued. To the benefit of grandparents and to the elder population as well as the youth and children. Demographic shifts are going to require innovation. Demographic shifts, migration will require innovation. We talked briefly about this. Standard family policies that focus solely on blood relations will become part of a broader package of family policies when we enter a period where the elder population is calling on new migrants and other parts of the society to help them in later life because of low fertility and internal displacement. But I'm all behind that innovations in this area.
There was also a question about whether the study covered East Asian countries.
Yes, it does, but bear in mind it's an opportune time to caution again. We have a phrase in England where we talk about a broken smile. When someone smiles, some of the teeth are missing. And we don't have all the teeth in the picture. There are some gaps in our data. but it does make a bit of a smile.
Thank you. Dominic, Ignacio.
I just wanted to make a small remark. I'm going to show you a web address now where you can find not only the webcast of this event, which, by the way, I'm being told that is followed now by more than 100 persons in different countries. Also all the documentation, the report on PDF, but there you will also be able to find in the future all these subsequent studies and all this data, as you were asking, for instance, about Nigeria. Okay, so I tried to show it now. No, I'll show it in a minute.
Great, thank you, Ignacio. That's very useful. Unless the other panelists have any burning desire to take the floor, I can have a couple more participants make a short intervention. Please.
This is so impressive and so needed. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful. My question is prevention. How much attention is given to helping young people? Getting jobs is very important, but how do we help them form families that aren't fragile? That's my question.
Thank you. Gentlemen.
If I may, I'd like to just make a comment about something abstract. We don't usually talk about love as a vital ingredient for every family, and we don't talk about it because we can't measure it, and it varies everywhere. But when there is love in the family, beginning with the oldest generation, it's something that's felt by the children and grandchildren and even the family pet. But it's something that allows the succeeding generations to see what an example the older generations are setting about their dedication to their work, that they're not going to stay home today because it's raining or snowing. And the children pick up on that, and the grandchildren pick up on that. So the older generations set this example. The other thing with love is to dedicate your purpose in life to giving more to the offspring than you want for yourself. And then thirdly, I'd just like to mention that because of these vital tools that everybody has expressed here today, we have all of these advocates in this room that could carry these messages back to their legislators, whether it's a city government that can provide more diapers for poor women, or state legislators that can do more about preventing violence, as Lynn said, or anything else. So I just wanted to mention that one of my favorite statements by an American educator, Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, and she was asked about her concept of love, and she said it's an invisible thread that stretches from one spirit to another. And I think of Mrs. John over here, who is going to be going to China, and I've read that as far as people setting examples and giving more to others than you want for yourself, I've read a Chinese philosophy that one generation plants the tree, the next one gets the shade. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I think we have now, well, maybe one last. Great.
Good afternoon, colleagues. And first of all, congratulations on the work. My name is also Dominic, and I've made it a habit of myself to always try to make an intervention when there's another Dominic in the room. And then I'll leave it to the crowd to see who's the better Dominic. But in this case, I don't think I'm the better one because you've done a lot of work in this effort. And further on to that, congratulations. And I wanted to catch on what you've mentioned before on the family as a fundamental unit of society. And Samoa and my delegation wholeheartedly agrees on this. And the evidence and the link of the family policies in the achievement of sustainable development is slowly but surely coming along in all the resolutions that we're finding in the UN. I guess my question would come on to being a small island And having this report is very remarkable for us in trying to attain all the different policies that will try to achieve the SDGs. But then there's a question about capacity and how we come along and how we implement the policies. I was just interested to know whether in the policy and in your work, whether there was an indication of how smaller islands would be able to encapsulate and capture the strengths of the policies and be able to partner up with different international organizations and different partners in how we could implement these policies, or we could. Thank you.
Thank you. Dominic, would you like to...
Maybe assume what's the first question?
Well, I can try. So I'd like to address a couple of questions that have been raised very briefly. I know we have very little time. I wish we could have more. But one, a question about the fragile, unstable families. And I encourage you to read the report, but also the study, my study that has more information. But we know that how young people participate, how they perform in the labor market, whether they have economic resources has direct implications for the ability to form their own families. And my study has provided a lot of research evidence on how unstable and fragile families have negative implications for youth development. But then again, we look at evaluated evidence. And in this case, I would say there's very limited data, unfortunately. And this is actually brings me to the question I also wanted to address about older people. And I absolutely agree about the importance of grandparents in bringing children, in creating the environment, support environment for them to develop further. And we know the importance of older people in different dimensions, economic, social capital, and childcare and everything. So, and in this case, I would like to encourage, and one thing is that in the studies that I looked at, that reviewed, unfortunately, there is very little attention given to the role of grandparents in bringing children and evaluating their impact on youth development and specifically on their participation in the labor market. I think the role remains, unfortunately, invisible. And this is something that I think also has to have attention from policymakers and stakeholders.
Thank you.
Thank you. So as soon as addressed on the prevention, I'd like to very briefly say something about love, if I can. I don't know why I didn't write the word in the report. I wrote emotional security. Maybe it reflects my emotional insecurity. Because I've written it in OECD reports before, and if it can be written in an OECD report, it can be written anywhere. Thank you for your intervention. I think it's important to remember the reality of what it means to be a human being and a family in advance of the technicalities of policy. Thank you, Dominic. It's nice to meet another Dominic. Small islands, we have a couple of small island evaluations in the study. Also some previous work we've worked on in the past, but myself and other parts of the team have looked at family policies in areas which are geographically sort of isolated. There's good examples in high-income countries, including the Greek islands. There's a lot of them, and they need schools. And up in the Arctic Circle. And then there's work that comes, a lot of the work is evaluation, which means isolated, programs, which could be transferred in different ways to whole policies. So there's opportunities there. And we also find just a small amount of information on the use of technology. So the use of Skype, for instance, to speak to people who may be very far away about family issues, which also have some positive effects. So that's all.
Thank you, Dominic. And now Michaela will have the last word.
Now, just to address international solidarity, which is very, very important. And for suicide in particular, I mentioned that the interventions are only for youth. And one of the main recommendations I have is these family interventions should be across life stages, including older adults, including, and then Lynn's questions in terms of prevention, that's very important and it really should be used. For example, they had patients with cardiovascular disease. When they go to the hospital, they would provide prevention intervention to family members who take the patient to hospital. Those prevention interventions were found to be very effective. So really prevention is something that really should be used for health promotion. So it's, it's a great opportunity to use it, and, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela, and thank you all speakers for their very interesting presentations, but also for sticking to their allotted time. Thank you all participants for very interesting questions. And my last message to you is really, as Ignacio has mentioned earlier, have a look at this report. It's really worth not only reading, but also using in our work. And so just don't put it on the bookshelf, but use it in your daily work and make sure that the results and the recommendations coming out of all the studies are used in pushing better family policies for the realization of the 2030 agenda. Thank you all.